The morning of my sister's wedding began the same way every family event had for the past decade, with my mother's carefully worded phone call. "Miranda, sweetheart," she began, her voice dripping with a mix of pity and control. "Please remember that this is your sister's special day. Dress nicely, smile, and try not to talk too much about work. We don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable." "Of course, Mom," I said, staring at the pale pink bridesmaid dress that hung in front of me like a punishment. I slipped it on anyway, knowing full well it made me look like a deflated cupcake. Work. That was the word my family never said in front of outsiders. To them, I didn't have a career. I had what they liked to call my situation. It sounded more like a chronic illness than a profession. In their eyes, I worked at a grocery store and had never risen above it. The truth was something entirely different. I was the founder and CEO of Redline Global Logistics, a company valued at $3.9 billion, operating in 42 countries, employing over 70,000 people. We specialized in streamlining global supply chains, building the invisible systems that kept food, medicine, and everyday products moving across the world. Our contracts included some of the biggest names in retail and pharmaceuticals. I spent my weeks negotiating mergers, optimizing international distribution routes, and addressing world leaders at economic forums. But to my family, I was the failure. It all began innocently enough years ago when I worked late-night shifts at a local supermarket. Back then, I was researching from the inside, wanting to understand exactly how products moved from suppliers to shelves. I stocked cereal boxes and rang up groceries, not because I had no other choice, but because I wanted to build something bigger. When relatives asked what I was doing, I said I was in food logistics. They smiled politely, translated it into, "Miranda works at the grocery store," and the label stuck. I never corrected them. Not after Uncle Tom patted my hand at Thanksgiving and said, "At least you're not unemployed." Not after Aunt Grace compared me to my sister, who had just passed the bar exam, and told me maybe I should consider night school. Correcting them meant opening myself up to skepticism, mockery, and long lectures about being realistic. So I stayed quiet. I let them believe I was simple, small, unambitious. A part of me wanted to see how long they could keep the story alive without ever asking me directly. The answer, it turned out, was indefinitely. The rehearsal dinner the night before had been its own test of endurance. My sister Alicia was marrying into a family of visible achievements. Her fiancé, Daniel, came from old money. His father owned a chain of luxury hotels. His mother sat on the board of an international charity. They carried themselves with the ease of people who had never worried about money, reputation, or status. "So, what do you do, Miranda?" one of Daniel's groomsmen asked me over wine. Before I could answer, Alicia swooped in with a laugh. "Oh, don't mind her. Miranda works at a grocery store. She's our family's little reminder that not everyone can be a superstar." The table chuckled politely. My sister's fiancé offered me a sympathetic smile, the kind reserved for stray dogs and forgotten coats. I just sipped my drink, saying nothing. It wasn't the first time she'd said something like that, but hearing it in front of strangers stung more than usual. My mother leaned over later and whispered, "She doesn't mean harm, darling. Just let her have her moment. Don't make a scene." I smiled and nodded. Making a scene wasn't my style. But part of me wondered why protecting her dignity was always more important than protecting mine. By the morning of the wedding, I was emotionally numb, bracing myself for the endless parade of comparisons. During hair and makeup, the bridesmaids, Alicia's friends from law school, chattered about their promotions, their travel plans, their future partnerships. When the inevitable question came, "And what about you, Miranda?" Alicia answered for me without missing a beat. "She's been working at the same grocery store for years. It's honest work." They smiled politely, the way people do when they don't know what else to say. One of them added, "Well, stability is a blessing." I laughed softly, agreeing, even though my so-called stability came from running a multi-billion-dollar empire with contracts across 5 continents. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Alicia looked radiant in lace. Daniel beamed with pride, and my parents cried tears of joy. I held my bouquet and focused on keeping my expression neutral, ignoring the whispers I caught behind me about how stress had aged poor Miranda, and how at least she seems happy in her simple life. By the time we moved to the reception hall, I was weary. Toast after toast celebrated Alicia and Daniel, their families, their ambitions. When Daniel finally raised his glass and thanked the incredible people who represent the best of achievement, his words turned inevitably to me. "And to Miranda," he said with a grin, "who proves that happiness doesn't always come from ambition. She's content with her simple life at the grocery store, and that's admirable in its own way." Polite applause followed. I forced a smile, though my chest burned. They applauded me like I was some charity case. Some fragile soul they pitied. That's when I saw him. My assistant James, walking through the crowd in his sharp black suit, cutting straight toward me. His voice was calm but carried across the room. "Boss," he said, just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "your helicopter is ready to leave this cheap party." The champagne glass in Alicia's hand slipped and cracked against the floor. Every head turned toward me, and for the first time all night, I didn't look away. The silence that followed James' words seemed to stretch on forever. Forks paused midair. Conversations died mid-sentence, and every face in that ballroom turned toward me. "Boss," Alicia repeated, her voice sharp, her carefully constructed smile trembling. What is he talking about?" James didn't flinch. He stood tall in his tailored suit, hands clasped loosely in front of him. His tone professional but unmistakably firm. "The helicopter is fueled and waiting. Ma'am, we'll need to depart in 20 minutes if we're to make the 9 p.m. call with Zurich." I felt every muscle in my sister's body stiffen beside me. She looked from me to James and back again, searching for the punchline. Her new husband, Daniel, frowned, clearly trying to decide whether this was some elaborate joke. A few guests chuckled nervously, waiting for me to laugh it off, but I didn't. I simply took a sip of champagne and set the glass down. "Miranda," my mother hissed under her breath. "What is going on? Is this some kind of prank?" I didn't answer her. Instead, I turned to James, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Thank you, James. Give me a few minutes. I'll be ready." He nodded once and stepped back, but his presence lingered like a storm cloud at the edge of the room. The whispers started almost immediately. "Helicopter. Zurich. Did she say call like business?" Uncle Tom leaned across the table, his face red from both wine and confusion. "Miranda, don't tell me you've gotten yourself into something shady. God knows there are scams out there. Are you in trouble?" I forced a smile. "No, Uncle Tom, I'm not in trouble." Alicia, on the other hand, wasn't smiling. She slammed her champagne flute onto the table, the sound sharp enough to make people flinch. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "She works at a grocery store. Everyone knows that. Mom, tell them." All eyes shifted to my mother. She looked as if she'd swallowed glass. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she said nothing. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Miranda's always been private. She doesn't like to brag. Perhaps her colleague here is exaggerating." Her words only added fuel to the fire. "Exaggerating?" one of Daniel's relatives repeated. "Either she has a helicopter waiting or she doesn't." My father, who had remained mostly silent until then, leaned forward, his tone gruff. "Miranda, what the hell is going on? If you've been hiding something." Before he could finish, Daniel raised his hand, trying to smooth things over. "Look, it's just a misunderstanding. Maybe this assistant of hers is confused. Let's not let this ruin the night." But Alicia wasn't having it. She stood abruptly, her dress swishing against the floor, and pointed a finger at me. "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you? You couldn't stand that this was my day, so you had to make it about you. Bringing some actor to play your assistant, talking about helicopters and Zurich calls. God, Miranda, it's pathetic." The room had gone deathly quiet again. I could see the discomfort on the guests' faces, some pitying me, others questioning Alicia's outburst. I stayed seated, keeping my tone even. You've always loved to underestimate me, Alicia. I never corrected you because it was easier. But maybe that was a mistake. She laughed, high-pitched and bitter. A mistake? No, Miranda. The mistake was thinking you'd ever amount to anything. You don't get to waltz into my wedding pretending to be something you're not. James cleared his throat politely. With respect, Mrs. Carter, he said, using her new married name, Miranda doesn't need to pretend. She runs a company that... Enough, Alicia snapped. Stop lying for her. This is my wedding, not some stage for her delusions. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the same one I'd carried for years as they dismissed me, laughed at me, and turned me into the family punchline. But tonight something in me hardened. I wasn't going to shrink anymore. I rose slowly from my chair. The movement alone seemed to silence the room. I didn't come here to steal your spotlight, Alicia. I came here to celebrate you. But if telling the truth makes you feel overshadowed, maybe that says more about you than it does about me. Gasps rippled across the tables. Alicia's face turned crimson. My father stood too, his voice booming. Miranda, sit down. This isn't the place. I met his gaze evenly. Isn't it? Because for years, you've all been perfectly comfortable turning family events into opportunities to humiliate me. You labeled me the failure, the charity case, the one with a situation. You never asked me directly. You just decided who I was and spread the story until it became truth. Several heads dropped, eyes shifting away from mine. And now, I continued, my voice steadier than I felt, the moment you're confronted with evidence that you might be wrong, you call me a liar. Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's that you're all too comfortable underestimating me because it makes you feel better about yourselves. The weight of my words hung in the air. No one dared speak. Even Alicia, for all her bluster, looked momentarily stunned. Finally, James stepped forward again, checking his watch. Ma'am, the helicopter pilot just confirmed. We'll need to leave shortly. All eyes snapped back to me, and this time no one was laughing. The ballroom felt smaller by the second, the air thick with judgment and disbelief. Dozens of eyes followed my every movement as if I had transformed into some unfamiliar creature they didn't know how to categorize. Alicia's hand was trembling as she clutched Daniel's arm. You see, she hissed loudly enough for half the room to hear. She's trying to humiliate me on my wedding day of all days. Daniel gave me an uneasy smile. Miranda, maybe it's best if you sit back down. No need to escalate. James interrupted smoothly. Mr. Carter, there is no escalation. This isn't a performance. My job is to make sure Miranda is exactly where she needs to be when she needs to be there. Right now, that happens to involve an international call worth several $billion. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Some people laughed nervously, assuming it was exaggeration. Others whispered behind their napkins, eyes darting between me and James like they were piecing together a puzzle that didn't fit. My cousin Julia shook her head in disbelief. Miranda, if this is some elaborate prank, it's gone too far. Helicopters, billion-dollar calls. Be serious. I didn't flinch. I've always been serious, Julia. You just never wanted to hear me. Uncle Tom leaned forward, his face ruddy. If you're really so important, then why do you drive that old rust bucket of a car? Why live in a modest apartment? Why show up looking like... He gestured at my pale pink dress with obvious disdain. Like this. I smiled faintly. Because I don't measure my worth in leather interiors or designer labels. Maybe that confuses people who do. Murmurs rippled again, louder this time. My father stood, his jaw set. Miranda, enough. You've embarrassed this family for years with your stubbornness. Don't you dare start spinning fairy tales here. That hit harder than I expected. Embarrassed you, I repeated softly. By choosing a different path, by refusing to play the role you wrote for me? My mother tried to cut in, her voice sharp. Miranda, please. But I wasn't finished. You've all been so quick to laugh at me, to dismiss me. When I said I was in logistics, you heard grocery clerk. When I mentioned hiring staff, you assumed I meant stocking shelves. When I traveled, you told yourselves it was training shifts, not boardrooms. You've built this whole narrative because it was easier than admitting you never bothered to ask me what I actually do. Alicia's face was flushed, her hands balled into fists. Stop acting like a martyr. If you were really this executive you're pretending to be, why wouldn't you tell us? Why keep it a secret? I looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, because humility isn't the same thing as invisibility. I thought if I kept things simple, maybe you'd see me for who I was, not what I'd achieved. Clearly, I was wrong. For a second, the room was silent again. Then my cousin Derek scoffed. Come on. Forbes list, helicopters, multi-billion-dollar deals. This is fantasy. If she were really who she says she is, we'd all know. It would be on the news. That James shifted. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he turned the screen toward the nearest table. A hush fell instantly. Projected on the screen was a headline from Bloomberg. Red Line Global CEO Miranda Hale to finalize $3.9 billion Zurich deal. My Aunt Susan leaned forward, her glasses sliding down her nose as she read aloud. Red Line Global, that's you. Always has been, I said simply. Shock rippled across the room like a wave. People craned their necks to see the headline. Phones came out, fingers tapping frantically. Within seconds, murmurs turned into open exclamations. Oh my God, it's true. She's really on the Forbes list. Miranda Hale. I didn't even connect the name. Alicia staggered back a step, her hand clutching the tablecloth for balance. No, this isn't possible. You let us believe you were struggling. You let me say those things about you. You weren't interested in the truth, I said evenly. You were interested in a story that made you feel superior, and I let you have it because fighting against that arrogance felt like shouting into the wind. Daniel looked stunned, his jaw tight as he whispered something to Alicia. She didn't answer. Her eyes were still locked on me, wide with disbelief and something else. Fear. Behind me, James cleared his throat again. Ma'am, the pilot is requesting confirmation. Zurich is waiting. I nodded slowly, then turned back to the room. I didn't plan to make a scene tonight. I didn't plan to say any of this. But maybe it's time to stop hiding. Maybe it's time you all finally understood who I am. I could feel the weight of every gaze pressing into me, a mix of shame, regret, awe, and fury. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one shrinking. They were. And the night wasn't over yet. The room buzzed like a hive. Screens glowed everywhere. My name reflected in 100 tiny mirrors. And the floor seemed to tilt as people tried to rearrange their memories to fit a new truth. Alicia's voice cut through the noise. You humiliated me, she said, breathless, in front of everyone. You did this to me. I met her eyes. I didn't do anything to you, Alicia. I stood here while you told a story about me that wasn't true. Tonight, it finally ran into a wall. She blinked hard. Daniel took her hand but didn't speak. My mother's lips were white. Miranda, she said carefully. If this is real, why wouldn't you tell us? Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you called it my situation. Because it was always a competition. Because bragging is ugly and silence felt safer. But I see now that silence also lets other people write your life for you. Uncle Tom cleared his throat, defensive out of habit. No one meant harm. You laughed, I said softly. You all laughed. And when you were finished, you called it harmless. James stepped close, lowering his voice. Ma'am, pilot confirms the slot at the hospital helipad, 2 blocks west. Car is at the service entrance, 8 minutes. Thank you, I said. I could feel the room listening even to that. Alicia's gaze sharpened. So, you're leaving now. You're proving everyone right. You never cared about family. Took a breath. I showed up for you. I wore the dress. I stood where I was told. Kept my mouth shut. Caring about family doesn't mean accepting the parts where they erase you. I reached into my clutch and pulled out an envelope heavy with cardstock. This is my gift. It's a contribution to the legal aid program you posted about last month. In your name. I scheduled it weeks ago. Her face flickered, confusion then.